Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 edition of the WTO Agriculture Symposium entitled Agricultural Trade and Food System Transformation. This is the very first time that we hold this symposium in virtual format and hope that this format will allow us to reach audiences near and far across different time zones. There are two ways to follow the proceedings of this symposium. The first is via the WTO YouTube channel, where the symposium is being live streamed. And the second is to register as a participant for the sessions that interest you in case you wish to take part in the live Q&A that will take place after each session. Whether for the live stream or for registration, viewers are advised to log on to the WTO Agriculture Symposium webpage by simply typing WTO Agriculture Symposium 2020 into their browsers and following the instructions on that page. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I will be moderating the opening session. The 2020 edition of the WTO Agriculture Symposium is a celebration of the 25th anniversary of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture and is designed to address the most topical issues in agriculture in preparation for the 2021 United Nations Food Systems Summit that has been called for by the United Nations Secretary General. The program will cover a range of different topics, from food security to food safety, nutrition, environmental sustainability, and the impact of COVID-19 on agricultural trade. It will also include two brainstorming sessions, one in which trade experts will brainstorm on forward-looking disciplines in the field of agricultural trade policy, and one in which farmers will be speaking to us firsthand on their experience with the Agreement on Agriculture. I hope that viewers will find these discussions informative, and I count on everybody's active engagement. So please let me, without further ado, introduce our opening panel to you. With us today are Alan Wolf, WTO Deputy Director General, Q Dongyu, FAO Director General, who will be joining with a bit of a delay, I believe. Michael Fakhri, United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. Agnès Kalibata, Special Envoy of the United Nations Secretary General for the 2021 United Nations Food Systems Summit. And Edwini Kessi, Director of the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division. I'll be handing the floor to each of these distinguished speakers for their opening remarks, and will then be taking questions from viewers. For questions, viewers are advised to type their questions into the live Q&A function at the bottom of their screens as the opening session proceeds. Let me now hand the floor to you, Alan, for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Doa. I will add my welcome to this third edition of the WTO Agricultural Symposium, an important annual rendezvous for addressing the most topical issues in agricultural trade. This year's symposium marks the 25th anniversary of the creation of the WTO and the entry into force of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture. On this special occasion, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers. In absentia, Chu Dongyu, the Director General of FAO, who's played a leading role this year in G20 summits. At the summit of leaders, he said, it is essential for the G20 to keep working on preventing this health crisis from becoming a global food crisis. His call to invest in agri-food systems, boost farmer productivity, scale up social protection mechanisms, and work on digital innovation have provided a roadmap for action. Dr. Agnès Kalibata, the Special Envoy for UN Secretary General for the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit. Dr. Kalibata, I wish to offer my somewhat belated congratulations to you on your nomination as Special Envoy of the UN Food Systems Summit. The size of the challenge before you is enormous. But who better than you to take on this role as a former Minister of Agriculture in Rwanda and President of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa? Anything we can do to help at the WTO, you can call upon us at any time. Dr. Michael Fakhri, I wish to congratulate you on your recent nomination as UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, which appointment took place in July. The timing of your nomination during a global pandemic and is a time for looking forward, and when it's also a time of great economic hardship. So it's an extraordinarily important appointment. Edwini Kessie, the distinguished director of the Agricultural Division of the WTO, will wrap up our speaking engagements this morning. Turning to the subject at hand, in feeding 1 in every 6 people around the globe, trade is a vital piece of the food systems and food security. The WTO's Agreement on Agriculture remains the only instrument that exists at the international level to govern global trade in agricultural products. Since its entry into force, world exports of agricultural products have tripled. That was in 1995, have tripled from $450 billion annually to $1.5 trillion annually. The agreement has, during this last quarter century, played a vitally important role in facilitating the flow of food from the lands of plenty to the countries that would otherwise be lands of food deficit. It is a mutually beneficial system that improves the lives of billions of people. The WTO Agriculture Agreement's role in ensuring orderly trade relations and in leveling the playing field is unique. While many of us would like to see its provisions strengthened, and indeed they should be, I'll get to that in a bit, we should not forget where it all started and what has been achieved. The world looked very different back in 1994, just prior to the entry into force of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture. World trade in agricultural products was distorted and disorderly. Many countries applied a wide range of unpredictable barriers to agricultural products. Through a process known as tariffication, quantitative restrictions, variable levies, import bans, and other non-tariff measures that had been widespread elements of agricultural protection at national frontiers were replaced with import duties. And then there were a series of tariff reductions that took place. So the achievement cannot be overstated. Similarly, world agricultural subsidy levels were sky high. These subsidies were leading to a crowding out of agricultural exports of many WTO members who had neither the desire nor, in many cases, the capacity to match these trade distorting measures. The Agreement on Agriculture brought an orderly classification of agricultural subsidies based on their degree of trade distortion. And while most distortive subsidies were reduced through a green box, as it's called, of permissible subsidies, members were granted the right to pursue food security, regional development, environmental policy, and other national goals. Recognizing the special challenge of developing countries, provisions were crafted within the agreement to allow them to deploy certain subsidies in support of low-income and resource-poor farmers. Article 20 of the Agreement on Agriculture is entitled Continuation of the Reform Process. It called for further negotiations with the long-term objective of more open agricultural markets. This led to another significant achievement, the commitment to completely eliminate agricultural export subsidies at the WTO's 10th Ministerial Conference in Nairobi, a result that would have seemed inconceivable just a few years earlier. This is not to say that a consensus or even a critical mass has been reached for more extensive reforms in the agricultural rules. It has not. There is now a pressing need for a breakthrough on all the major subjects under discussion at the WTO, on domestic support, on market access, on food security, on cotton, and others. There's no good alternative to making progress in a multilateral setting. No regional trade agreement has ever tackled the issue of agricultural subsidies. These agreements tend to remain focused on preferential market access. A judgment should always be made as to whether any given sub-multilateral, that is, a regional or a bilateral agreement, is of benefit to non-signatories, to the world at large as well. Looking at global trade once again, the record of the multilateral trading system has delivered some other strong positive results from 1995 to today. The share of the developing world in world agricultural trade has risen significantly, but progress still needs to be made. There's no room for complacency. COVID-19, the pandemic, should be a wake-up call for all of us. At the outset of the crisis, many policymakers feared that a global health crisis would turn into a food crisis as well. This fear was driven by the realization that food systems across the globe are now deeply interconnected and that trade restrictions can create serious and irreversible damage to global food production. Today, agricultural production takes place within global value chains. International trade in food has gone far beyond a bag of rice or a bushel of wheat crossing a national border. Primary commodities cross national borders on average at least twice, as they are exported for processing into food, and then to come back again as a finished product. In March 2020, by the then Director General of the WTO and the Director General of the World Health Organization, and by Chu Dongyu on behalf of the FAO, a call was issued by them to keep food markets and trade open, and that largely took place. To date, since the beginning of the crisis, agricultural trade has suffered less during this COVID-19 pandemic than have other economic sectors and other trade sectors. And in fact, there have been about as many trade opening as trade restricting policies implemented in agriculture. Many countries moved to reduce food import tariffs to increase access to staples during the disruptions caused by the pandemic, and took the important step into the digital age by making available electronic customs procedures. We were all forced to move, as we have today, into the digital age, and agriculture has moved with it. The lessons from the pandemic for global food systems is clear. The continued strengthening of the WTO agreement on agriculture is absolutely vital. The world should no longer have to rely on political pleas and declarations issued at times of crisis to keep food markets open. Food should always be able to travel across borders, particularly in times of crisis. A strengthened agreement on agriculture should make this outcome beyond question. I urge participants in this symposium to use the next 2 days to consider practical avenues for strengthening the WTO rulebook on agriculture. The sector must deliver food security, environmental sustainability, nutrition, and other common goals. What the WTO's members decide to do can contribute not only to an improved trading system for agriculture, but support can make a substantial contribution to the needed economic recovery. Thank you very much. I look forward to listening to our other speakers.
Thank you very much, Alan, for walking us through the long history of the Agreement on Agriculture. Director General Chu Dongyu, welcome to the WTO, to the virtual version of the WTO. Good morning to you, and could you please take the floor now to speak to us about the food systems of the future?
Okay, thank you, Madam Moderator. And also my dear brother, Alan Wolf. Listening what you made a very substantial, comprehensive, holistic speech. I learned from you. Yeah, this time, it's really timing to have those kind of symposium to build up more solidarity, more consensus between agriculture and the trade sectors. Agriculture and food is essential. No matter you're poor or rich, you are young and senior, you're a man or woman. So that's why they say, I always say food is a basic human right for all of us. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be part of this symposium. And I promised to my friend Alan Wolf, I will make this very tight schedule today. I started with 1 hour ago with European Parliament. Also talk about the food, nutrition, and also the fight against hunger. That's a critical time. And today I will have another 5 agenda. So I think you can see the agriculture of food and trade should be closely linked. You can't just produce. That's why the very early stage of this pandemic, I put all the efforts. Now I can tell you the Ambassador Alan. It was not easier in the early first week of March. They are not so willing to do so. But I said, no, we should keep the international trade functioning, get the early warning. And then I had a talk, private talk with the Secretary General. Please talk with the key leaders and make agriculture production and the trade should be, because that time is spring, you have to produce more, and also you have to keep the trade function. You know, now it's, at that time, nobody predicted the pandemic is so serious. Well, I'm from China, and the crisis is not only crisis, it's a danger and it's opportunity if we deal with it properly. I think today you initiate this forum, this dialogue. I think it's very important. We can't waiting for something happening. We have to in advance or prevent something for better. That's, I think, during the crisis that we have to do. That's why I had, as you see, you also participated in the G20 summit. We can't wait another spring. No, winter time, it's a good time to deep thinking and to cooling down yourself first and cooling down your mind. Especially as a DG or DDG, now you are DG interim. In my opinion, you are DG interim, but nobody nominated you. But you play the role as a DG interim. From my personal view, observation, I saw you are always on the international big stage on behalf of WTO. So I think that's your contribution. History will remain and record you. Not only someone or some individual record us. That's why I'm bold and brave to do something. Last year in Berlin, and we said that we should do something. Don't complain. Don't regret. Try your best to do something. Good for people. Good for your members. So the future of agri-food system, I said agri-food system. A lot of people talk about food system. Agri-food system started from the ground, from the soil, not from factory. Yeah? You know, you're from America, I'm from China, and especially from the Africa. And also you are a director for agriculture is from Caribbean region, I think. So you see, if we started from the soil, and you will definitely relate to environment. If we don't address the soil health and the water pollution and all those rivers, no base of agriculture, no qualified high quality agri-food raw material. How can you run it with a high quality of food? So that's why I always say agri-food system. will define the humanity future. Because that's a connected human being and the environment and the food supply and the economy, of course. 2030 agenda calls for action to end hunger, eliminate all forms of malnutrition by ensuring the sufficient quantity of safe, nutrition, affordable, healthy food available to all. I said sufficient quantity first. And then you have a safe, nutritious, affordable, healthy food. How can enough quantity? Because we will have a 10 billion big table to feed. 10 billion people. That's the biggest table on the ground, on the earth. We have to feed them first, yeah? And then feed them well, and then feed them sustainably, and then feed them with food diversity. So it's a different level. I also call on for this goal to be achieved when the creating economic growth and employment opportunities needed to eradicate poverty, reduce the inequality, sustain biodiversity, and the natural resource environment, adapted to the growing stresses of climate change. Climate change creates a lot of stress, natural stresses. I said, very scientific way. I don't want to create a political misleading interpretation. I said biotic, abiotic stress. That's a very scientific term. Biotic, abiotic stress of climate change. We need our agri-food system to deliver food security and better nutrition for all, to be economically sustainable, to be inclusive, and to have a positive impact on climate and environment. Unfortunately, we all know that our temperate agri-food systems are not fulfilling this aspiration. Urgent action is therefore required by all the key players and partners. Let us first acknowledge the many challenges facing agri-food system today. That's numbers I repeated so many times, and I always say nearly 690 million people suffering from chronic hunger today, up nearly 600 million in the last 5 years. And the health stats cost far more than the international poverty threshold of $1.9 per day, making it unaffordable for more than 3 billion people in the world. So if you look at the starch consumption for basic energy of the human being, we only have less than 10% are suffering. But if you look at the high level of the nutrition and life, we still have 3 billion people are not enough for the health stats. So FAO, WTO, we are working for the global, not only for the, of course, we have to address the issues related to vulnerable. And at the same time, we have to move up to the rest 90%. That's also our custom we have to offer. That's in that sense, trade, they have 2 basic functions. First, keep the stable food for all, especially for vulnerable people during the pandemic, during crisis, during the conflict. Second, the rest 90% more depend on the trade. That's why the Chinese, when I was vice president in charge of international and trade, we opened to the market for America, for Chile, for Argentina, or for Africa also. We imported the cherry from the Chile, because that's not for basic requirement. It's for nutrition health stats. That's for the rest 90% who have already overcome the hunger. Yeah. So I think the burden of the malnutrition in all its form remains a challenge. Roughly 144 million children under the age of 5 are stunted. 47 million are wasted, and 38 million are overweight. So we have to address all the issues from the agri-food system first, not only from WHO. Nutrition is not the matter of the WHO. We should start from agri-food system first, because if we produce the high nutritional functional food like fiber, edible fiber food, it's good for your health food. You can't eat every day as a medicine, but you have to eat food every meal, every day. That's all for your health condition basic. Yeah. If you look at 90% people are not medical people, medical disease patient people. 90 people are normal people. Yeah, 90%. So don't forget the 90 people. We have more requests on the nutrition, food. And so the global economic downturn caused by COVID-19 is expected to make the situation worse. Added 132 or 150 million people to the rank of undernourished 2020. That's our FAO research report, together with others. Threatening to reverse the progress achieved over the last 2 decades. That's a real challenge for SDGs. Yeah. At the sum of our current agri-food systems are estimated to contribute about up to 37% of greenhouse gas emission, continue to overuse scarce natural resources. We all needed to work harder to address these challenges and to move towards a sustainable food system. That's for sure. First, we need to better understand and minimize the trade-offs that exist between the competing policy objectives. For instance, adopting more sustainable technology, well, the better for the environmental sustainability, might cost comparatively higher food price and jeopardize the food security and the nutrition for the poor. How can we deal with it holistically? Yeah. How to share the cost? How to use wisely of the agricultural subsidy? Yeah, agricultural subsidy increase. It's a good. It's a signal. It's a strong indication of the civilization, because most vulnerable people live in the countryside, no matter in Europe, or America, in China, or in Africa. Most vulnerable poor people live in the countryside. So we need more subsidy to agriculture. Don't blame the agricultural subsidy, but please make wise use of agricultural subsidy. That's please, I also ask my colleague from WTO to look at it. Otherwise, the people that say WTO against the agricultural subsidy. No, I'm a son of the farmer, much behind of infrastructure and production support from even American farmers. You need more subsidy, but how to use it, not to disturb international trade. That's your job. From point of view, FAO and the Minister of Agriculture, we need more, because the people live in the city more and more, and the rich people live in the city, and the poor people live in the countryside. So we need more support from the national financial, public financial, private financial support, the rural development. Otherwise, we don't have civilization. We don't have a real harmony society. That's a big inequality between city and rural. Not only women and men, and between rich and poor. So please, to be clear, I wanted to really ask my colleague from trade sector, don't blame the agricultural subsidy, but please make it wise, efficient use, and to avoid distorting international trade. Even within country, some big country also, the producer of food and the trade of food trader, food producer, and food consumer. There are 3 key groups. You have to understand each other. So I think we address this trade-offs. We need to invest in research and development and infrastructure to increase the productivity and efficiency, to improve the income distribution across the within country, to increase the purchase power. That's the only solution. We have to invest more research and development and infrastructure in the agri-food system and improve their productivity efficiency. To achieve this, improve linkage between research and extension, data analysis, evidence, and decision-making tools are critical. Second, we need to harness the power of digital technology to achieve a transformative change. That's why during past 10 years, I always focus on that. I was honored to host the Alan Wolf 3 years ago in China. So we really wanted how to help smallholder farmers to remotely improve their livelihood by digitalization of agri-food system. Integration robot and big data in agriculture already play the key role in sustainably meeting the growing demand of food and the future. Quality development and the 4R, reduce, recycle, recycle, utilize, the 4Rs approach should be established. Integration of the package of solution on efficiency of water, land, and agricultural input, including fertilizer, chemicals, and others. However, most government and food actors have not yet to harness the power of this technology. That's really gap. Not only in the developed nation, even developed nation. I had a talk with the Honorable USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue. He also realized the gap between city and rural areas in the digitalization. For this, I needed to partner and work closely with the private sector promotion, inclusiveness, and business model to reduce the digital divide between the countries and the regions, between city and rural areas. Third, we must strengthen the governance and human capital and the institution. We need to build up the capacity in countries, but also to strengthen our capacity for collective action to develop the agri-food system we want. Actions to address these challenges will be accelerated through the UN Food System Summit, through the many multi-stakeholder platforms and initiatives, which have been formed to support the development of more sustainable food systems. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 deadlines to achieve the sustainable development goals is rapidly approaching. We need to intensify addressing the challenges facing food system. Using all the means, tools, and the mechanisms available to us, there is no time to waste. Trade is one of these tools. It can boost the farmers' productivity and income. It increases their participation in the market and value chains and contribute to the more efficient use of natural resources. That's really build up the sharing economy globally. Yeah? Which country, which region, areas that have your advantage in natural conditions should be in favor of production, those kind of specific products. Trade also helps to reduce season scarcity of food during the normal agricultural production cycle, but also provide an important mechanism to address the production shortfalls or supply chain disruptions caused by the adverse or unforeseeable events such as COVID-19. That's why aging in the March 2031, as the pandemic was unfolded, agent invited the two heads of WTOs and WHOs to issue a joint statement calling on the government to minimize the impact of COVID-19 related border restrictions on trade in food. Trade adds to the variety of the food available in the market and can contribute to the lowering food prices, making it more affordable, sustainable in challenging areas, in particular for the most vulnerable population. Finally, trade can play the crucial role in both climate change adaptation and mitigation. Trade promotes the use of natural resources based on the country's comparatively advantage, which prevent their off-exploitation. So the transformation agri-food system is the global priority and the core of the FAO's mandate. And the trade is the key enabler for our food systems to become more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive. For this, we need to promote the policy coherence within among countries, promote innovation and digital technology, strengthen international governance mechanisms. This 25th anniversary is an excellent opportunity to recognize the important role played by the WTO in this regard. It is also an opportunity to reflect on the necessary action to increase the confidence in multilateralism. This is fundamental. Harmonizing production, trade, and consumption at the global, regional, and the national level is urgently needed to adjust. We hope that this symposium will contribute to gain a better understanding of the vital role of the market and trade in transforming agri-food system and foster fruitful dialogue and cooperation on the way forward. Trade is build the dependence and share the future for all of us. Let's make a trading system more smooth, more beneficial to all the members, and that's our job. Let's work together. Thank you, Alain. Give me an opportunity.
Director General Dong-Yu, allow me to thank you on behalf of the WTO for these very comprehensive remarks and very inspiring words, and indeed a massive challenge ahead of us. The FAO is certainly one of the WTO's most important partners in the field of agriculture. Michael Fakhri, let me turn to you. We would now like to hear from you about the role of international trade in food security. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Doa, and thank you, everyone. I'm really honored to be here today. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, I obviously bring my expertise in human rights. But before I became a human rights expert, I was actually an international trade law and agriculture expert as well. That was my primary area of research. And in my research, I've looked at how the question of food and agriculture has been central to international trade regimes for the past 120 years. And what I've learned is that you can't understand international trade regimes without understanding questions of food security. And you can't have a food security policy without addressing international trade. My first report as UN Special Rapporteur was on international trade, and I presented it to the UN General Assembly in October, where I received favorable interest from the EU, from the African group, and from the non-aligned movement. So my remarks today draw from my 20 years of research on trade and my official report. And in my remarks, there's three things I want to cover. First, I'll point out how food security has always been part of the WTO. It's always been a WTO issue. I'll then frame how I see the problems before us today. And I'll conclude with some ideas on how to frame the solution. So on how food security is a WTO issue. I know for the last year, many people have talked about the crisis at the WTO. But I find all this crisis talk misses the long-standing issue of agriculture at the WTO. The question of food and agriculture has regularly been addressed. It was regularly addressed under the GATT and was a contentious issue since the inception of the WTO. It divided farmers all over the world during the Uruguay round, and it wasn't just developed versus developing countries. This was within countries. Farmers had profound disagreements. And the issue of agriculture has been an unresolved sticking point in the Doha development round. And then with the food crisis in 2008, food security became a huge point of debate, especially over the question of national stockpiles and farmer support. Now, since the food crisis, the Bali and Nairobi ministerial decisions were significant advancements in the realm of agriculture and food security. Before Bali and Nairobi, food security was treated mostly as a non-trade issue, not really covered at a high level at the WTO. But thankfully today we're in a better position to talk about food security at the WTO. Now, the Bali and Nairobi ministerial conferences only provided short-term solutions, and there remains an open call for permanent solutions. I was at the Buenos Aires ministerial, and there was no real advancement on that issue at the time. Hundreds of civil society organizations have supported the call for a permanent solution so that trade better serves food security goals. So allow me now to turn to how I frame the problem and a helpful way to frame the problem. The core debate in agriculture has always been the issue of subsidies, not so much the issue of tariffs. Of course, the issue of tariffs matters, but as we've already heard, the issue of subsidies for the last century and then some, it's always been over subsidies. Regional and bilateral agreements are very popular these days, but as we heard from Ambassador Wolf, they only focus on tariffs and market access. From an international farm policy and a food security perspective, again, I want to echo Ambassador Wolf's remarks, the WTO remains the only place to address the core issue of subsidies. The agreement on agriculture has also provided some theoretical opportunities for some countries to have more flexibility with their agricultural policies. So these are things like special and differential treatment and special safeguards after tariffication. But these have proven to be ineffective in addressing food security concerns. The G33 has proposed broader special safeguard measures and proposed exceptions for special products. And there's also been a call for special attention to food needs of least developed countries and net food importing developing countries. But again, these issues have remained contentious and unresolved. Let me broaden out a bit more before pointing to some productive avenues. Trade policy is primarily focused on economic frameworks and has either ignored or marginalized people's human rights concerns. At the same time, human rights policy has provided a powerful socio-political critique of trade, but it has not offered an institutional alternative to the existing regime. Neither approach has adequately responded to climate change. My report to the General Assembly blends trade and human rights perspectives and provides new principles and an institutional map for how to move forward. Part of moving forward includes talking about transforming food systems. This will have to include institutional changes. Today, the WTO is at a historical moment. It has the opportunity to transform itself to respond to contemporary problems. Now allow me to frame the solutions. I'll conclude in terms of ideas on how to think about solutions. But what this really is an invitation. It's an invitation. I'd like to invite governments, I'd like to invite international civil servants and members of civil society and the audience members today to reach out to me to continue this conversation. I want to invite people to start thinking in newer ways, allowing for new solutions to arise. I know that the G33 has been frustrated with the agreement on agriculture, and now more recently, the Cairns Group has been challenging things more publicly. Those two blocs may not agree on much, but they do agree that things must change. And I provide more details in my UN report, but let me just point to some starting points. I think the WTO could be a good place to develop international food agreements. These would be plurilateral agreements that all fall within the umbrella of GATT. These international food agreements would be about developing trade policy around two issues: aid and subsidies. The purpose would be to ensure that markets are fair and stable while also tackling food security concerns head on. International food agreements would be something between the GATT and the Agreement on Agriculture. And here's what I mean by that. The GATT imagined the world as interconnected domestic markets, whereas the Agreement on Agriculture's goal was to construct a single global market. International food agreements could be more nuanced. They could focus on one commodity, certain staples like wheat or rice, or they could be more ambitious and create regional food markets. The WTO could then provide active support to make sure that when you combine all these international food agreements together, they would create a stable, fair, and coherent international market. To be clear, these are not old-style international commodity agreements, which focused on supply management, nor would they be regional trade agreements which focus only on market access and tariff reduction. My report draws a clear institutional map how international food agreements are achievable and how they could be anchored in the GATT interface system. Now, this word interface was more common in the past, in the days of the GATT, but I think it's worth reviving. GATT is structured in a way that recognizes different types of economies and contexts, the interface of different systems. And then what it also does is it ameliorates the international tensions caused by those differences. International food agreements would have the same elements of transparency and monitoring that define the modern WTO. Again, the two core trade issues for international food agreements could be aid and subsidies. And let me provide some details and conclude. On the issue of trade in trade policy, I think it should cover at least three particular issues. The first has to do with making sure that aid does not have the effect of dumping. The 1967 International Grains Agreement was a breakthrough in that regard and provides an interesting starting point. It attempted to create a stable grain market, and it also made sure that aid would not disrupt local producers. A second point, building on that, to more contemporary issues, is there's a current debate over how humanitarian relief relates to export restrictions. And then the third point I'd like to add is the issue of how economic sanctions are used in geopolitics. Economic sanctions usually have deadly effects on civilian lives. Now I'll turn to subsidies. This is the heart of the matter, to echo Director General Kyu Dong-yu. For the past 120 years, trade regimes have been where governments work out what counts as a good subsidy and a bad subsidy. And these ideas are always changing over time. In many ways, the Agreement on Agriculture reflects a consensus from the 1980s. In light of the 2008 food crisis, the current hunger crisis caused by COVID-19, and who knows what else climate change will bring in our future, we clearly need to renegotiate what counts as a good subsidy and a bad subsidy. And I hope I'm echoing Director General Kyu Dong-yu in that regard. To conclude, again, this is an invitation to start a fresh conversation around these issues. I encourage everyone to reach out to me, and I'm happy to collaborate with everyone. COVID-19 has just been a warning shot of what is yet to come. Climate change is here. And from a human rights perspective, I can see that things are still going to get a lot worse before they get better. What happens in the next year or so will determine the fate of the world's food systems for decades to come. And I want to end with a call to action to everyone, to the peasant and farmer movements, to the associations of fishers and pastoralists, to the food workers and their unions, to the women groups, to the youth groups, to consumer and producer cooperatives, to indigenous peoples, and to governments. A call to everyone to come together to create international food agreements that serve the people. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much for these very thoughtful comments and for the human rights approach that you have taken to food security. You have placed the emphasis on subsidies, and as Deputy Director General Alan Wolf has said, very few regional trade agreements address subsidies, and both you and Director General Dong-yu have clearly said that we need to distinguish between good and bad subsidies. A very topical issue. Thank you for putting the spotlight on this issue. And yes, Kalibata, let me now turn to you. We look forward to your comments on the role of international trade in world food system transformation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dewald. Thank you for that, for those kind remarks and for the introduction. I also wanted to take a moment and thank Ambassador Alan, for the offer of support and collaboration with the Food System Summit. So we have 9 months, and in those 9 months, we look forward to working with you and ensuring that we resolve some of these challenges the previous speakers have put forward, have put in front of us. Now, I had an opportunity to look at the report you sent me, the role of international trade in world food, the role of international trade in world food systems transformation, which I found extremely informative. And I just wanted to mention 2 things that I saw from that report. And then I'll come to the Food System Summit. Reading the report, it is very clear, but we all already knew this, that we are definitely producing enough food. Having food in our environment is not the problem. The problem is where the food is at and who has access to it. So I wanted to recognize the fact that we have mastered the art of producing food. And that has given us 3 things that come out of the report very clearly. We have been able to move food around in a way that makes it affordable for a lot of people. We have been able to ensure that food production is optimized in areas that provide the best opportunities for these places to provide food, and so really reducing impact on our environment in one way. We have been able to survive COVID from a food perspective, like Ambassador said earlier, and also Director General FAO mentioned it. We definitely would have been in a different world, didn't we have, if we hadn't had a system like this that allows global trade to continue. But all that was before COVID-19. That was the normal that was before COVID-19. Now we have a new normal that must recognize the number of challenges we have amidst us. We need to recognize that our environmental footprint on food production is unacceptable. We need to recognize that our footprint and how we move food around, including how we get to our table, but also how much we get to waste in this process is just not acceptable. And most important, we need to recognize that the people that have been left outside, affordable food, even as I talked about affordability of food earlier, having seen what COVID is showing us today, the fragility of our systems is just unacceptable. If I give you an example, here in Kenya, the World Bank has been putting out reports on the state of economy in countries. And here in Kenya alone, this year, we expect 2 million people to fall out of poverty. So again, the shakiness and fragility of the system we are living in is just unbelievable. The report also highlighted another thing that I wanted to bring out for you. There are major parts of the world that don't seem to understand that there's a global trade happening. And those parts of the world include my own continent, Africa. So I don't know whether this is a choice or whether this is inability to figure out what needs to be done, or whether this is a latecomers advantage where firstcomers are deeply entrenched and there's no room for more people to come in. Whatever the reason may be, we need to think about what we have signed up to in Agenda 2030. In that agenda, we recognize that non-distorted functional trade functional global markets is critical to ending hunger, is critical to improving nutrition, and is critical to sustainable development of our world. In particular, Goal 17 talks about how reaching out and including and ensuring participation of developing countries is important. To be honest with you, what a smallholder farmer in Africa needs to be able to produce, to be able to have food security is a market. They don't need subsidies, they don't need free stuff or free anything. They need a market for their produce. That's all the incentive they need. And I imagine that's what most farmers need around the world. Just imagine a cocoa farmer or a coffee farmer in Africa has to maintain a plantation because in some places have to maintain plantations because there are bylaws that ensure that these plantations are maintained. In a market where the ridiculous amount of money in these markets is just unbelievable, why would African farmers or any farmers in the world maintain farming of any commodity that is so hugely tradable because there are bylaws that ensure that they maintain those commodities? So there's a lot to do, and I wanted to talk to you. A few days ago, I was talking to a group of people and I was talking about trust. Here I want to talk about confidence. The issue here is we need, as a global community, to start building confidence among people, among smallholder farmers, among all these people that are impacted by how our trade system works, that it's going to be fair to them. We need to start building confidence that we can actually come through on the SDGs as they are registered, the pieces of the SDGs that talk about trade. We also need to come through on our environment. And we need to start working and demonstrating that we actually have the capability to do this and building confidence in our society that we can do this. But I just wanted to say that you're not alone. That's why the Food System Summit was put in place. It was put in place so that we can bring out some of these challenging conversations, like Ambassador Alan started out saying, so that we put them in the open and discuss them. We look at what will work and what won't work. We have a scientific group that is working on putting forward the evidence of some of the shifts that must happen in our food system. I know Maximo Torero is coming after this and is part of that scientific group. And whether we are looking at trade-offs, whether we are looking at new direction, whether we are looking at what we must do differently, the most important thing is it must be anchored in science to make sure it's not becoming debatable. We do have action tracks that we have put in place across all the areas that we see major challenges. And these action tracks are opportunities for you all to engage and also provide your input and ensure that some of the ideas that are being put forward are things we have discussed, are things we have agreed on, and are things that offer solutions at scale for a majority of people. We do have what we call food systems dialogue. These dialogues are happening at country level in different countries. And as Michael says in his presentation, part of what I would like to see is that we are giving communities a chance to discuss some of the unsaid issues, some of the reasons farmers don't understand why they still don't have food security. Michael started out saying that food security trade is critical to food security. Can we address some of these conversations as we're having food systems dialogues at country level, in independent dialogues, but also as we're going to global dialogues that are happening alongside the Food Systems Summit dialogues. So this is really an opportunity to encourage you to be part of these conversations, to invite you to be part of these conversations, to encourage you also to be ambitious and to work with us on really ensuring that we are putting forward our best foot to ensure we are saving ourselves, we are ensuring that all people are participating, but most of all, we are saving our planet. The burden we are putting on our planet is no longer sustainable. That's why the Secretary General called for a Food Systems Summit. And again, I look forward to continuously engaging with you to ensure that we continue coming up with solutions together. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And I look forward to the recommendations of your meetings.
Thank you very much, Agnes, for these remarks, for giving us context on how the UN Food Systems Summit is coming along, and for your central message, which is that farmers need markets, which is indeed what the WTO is about. It is about the creation of those markets. Edwini Kessi, let me now come to you, and we look forward to your remarks on the WTO Agreement on Agriculture at 25. Over to you.
Thank you, Dora. Let me start by thanking all the previous speakers for their interventions and for finding time. Can you hear me?
Very well, yes.
Okay, because I got a message. So, all right, good. So I said I wanted to start by thanking all the previous speakers for their interventions and also for finding time to celebrate with us the 25th anniversary of the Agreement on Agriculture. A wealth of information has been presented on the future of food systems, the UN Food Systems Summit, and the human right to food. As mentioned by DGG Alan Wolf, these 2 days are intended to provide an opportunity for delegations, civil society, academics, and the private sector to discuss the many important issues that you have all raised, as well as other topics on the agenda. I would simply like to use the time allocated to me to highlight some of the main trends we have seen in world trade in food and agricultural products over the past 25 years. While on some fronts there has been radical change, on others, the world has virtually stayed the same. I would then like to set out some of the factors which in the future may propel further change, factors which undoubtedly would be considered in the 2 days of the symposium. The COVID-19 pandemic was certainly a disruptor, but there will be many other disruptors going forward. The WTO rulebook must stand prepared to weather these changes and continue to provide a solid governance framework. Towards the end of my talk, I'll comment briefly on the important monitoring role that the WTO plays in the field of agricultural trade policies, a role that will become ever more important in the future. World trade in agricultural products has risen significantly over the past 25 years. In fact, agricultural exports more than tripled from $450 billion to $1.5 trillion, representing an average annual growth of 5% per year. However, the share of agricultural products in total merchandise trade has fallen, mainly due to the higher rate of growth of industrial products. Actually, it's about 9%, so it's less than 10%. The main traders and composition of agricultural trade has also changed, and in a very positive way, I may add. Asia, South and Central America, and Africa have all become important traders. This is a good sign, as it shows that the trading system has begun to deliver the market access opportunities that the developing world has been seeking. Also significant is the change in the role of China in world agricultural markets. Today, China has risen to become the world's greatest net food importing country, with a trade deficit for agricultural products of around 80 billion. Back in 1995, it had been a net exporter. The composition of world agricultural trade is also unsurprisingly different. The most highly traded agricultural products today are soya beans, food preparations, wine, and alcoholic beverages. Their combined share in total agricultural trade stands at 10%. Back in 1995, the top three products were coffee, wheat, cigarettes, and tobacco. There is no doubt, however, that one of the most important changes experienced over the past 25 years relates to the rise of agricultural global value chains. While 61% of value-added content of world agricultural products originate from the agricultural industry, the remaining value added comes from manufacturing and services. Back in 1995, our food systems were less globalized. To drive home the point of our globalized food production, I'd often like to say that our food is assembled and not produced. A bar of chocolate provides the perfect example. Most people don't realize the number of countries involved in the production of a simple chocolate bar. West African countries, particularly Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, my own country, are the leading producers of cocoa today, accounting for some 60% of world cocoa supply. The milk that goes into our chocolate comes from many different locations. Among the world's top milk exporting countries are New Zealand, Germany, the Netherlands, and the United States. In a bar of chocolate, we also find sugar, and we find various additives and flavorings, which are themselves sourced from across the globe. Among the world's top sugar exporting countries are Brazil, Thailand, India, France, and Guatemala. And I'll spare you the details of hazelnuts and raisins, which would come from yet another set of countries. Not to mention that when that bar of chocolate is finally assembled, it needs packaging, marketing, transportation, and retail sale. All of these goods and services can also come from different countries, different locations. So the reality is that a bar of chocolate is not made in any particular country. It is actually made in the world. And that does not stop with chocolate, but applies to many of our foods. The extent to which our food systems at the global level have become integrated is therefore notable and represents a sizable change from 1995 to today. Let me now turn to what has not changed very much, and that is what I will call concentration. A few countries account for the bulk of world's energy intake, and a few countries also account for the bulk of exports of the most traded commodities. Today, global food security is underpinned by trade in three main crops: maize, wheat, and rice, which account for around 60% of global food energy intake. A fourth crop, soybean, is the world's largest source of animal protein feed, accounting for 65% of global protein feed supply. Similarly, commodity exports continue to be concentrated by amongst a few countries as they were back in 1995, although with a different country composition. For example, 100% of the world's soybean exports are exported by only 10 countries. The same applies to rice and many other commodities. The top 10 exporters of rice have accounted for over 90% of world exports, whether in 1995 or today. The top 10 exporters of wheat account for 88% of world exports. The top 10 exporters of cotton account for 90%, and the top 10 exporters of meat account for 70%. Finally, the phenomenon of thin agricultural markets that existed back in 1995 continues to be with us today. Only 25% of world wheat production enters international trade. And for the rice market, it is even thinner, with only 5% of world rice production entering into international trade. The concentration of our energy intake of the main exporters of key commodities and the persistence of fairly thin market for certain commodities does not, however, negate the fact that our food is much more globally produced. This should not make us pause. This should make us pause and reflect on the implications of this trend. Clearly, we need to continue to open markets, as DG Dongyu, Michael, and others have said, and to level the playing field in agricultural trade to allow for greater diversification. The COVID-19 pandemic delivered a wake-up call on the need to protect GVCs in agriculture and prevent them from breaking up under the weight of food export restrictions and other trade barriers erected at the peak of the crisis. To some extent, policymakers succeeded in this mission, with warnings issued by the WTO and other international organizations such as WHO, FAO, and G20 leaders. But as GGG Wolf just said, the WTO rulebook needs to be upgraded to deal effectively with protectionist policies and not only contain pleas and declarations. All WTO members should be prepared to contribute to the enhancement of the WTO rulebook. A fairer and market-oriented agricultural trading system is in the interest of all members, WTO members. So the necessary compromises have to be made for this objective to be realized. We have the negotiations started in 2000 and we are in 2020, but we haven't yet seen significant progress. We need to make progress on disciplined domestic support, which in fact, the total entitlements of countries will soon be approaching $1 trillion. And that will definitely upset the global landscape. Instead of competitiveness, it shouldn't depend on the size of the pockets of governments. So we need to move to disciplined domestic support. We also need to bring down tariffs on agricultural products, which currently is twice as much as that of industrial products. We also need to move to have effective disciplines on export restrictions, while also taking into account the special issues of interest to developing countries, including public stockholding, SSM, and other issues of importance. They are not mutually exclusive. We could have a robust system which actually balances the interests of all countries. As we look into the future, agricultural trading system will be confronted with many other disruptors. These include automation and digitalization of agriculture and generally technological change, all in the face of significant stresses, rising global population, urbanization, and climate change. As our agricultural trading system continues to be called upon to move food from one end of the globe to the other, it is incumbent upon WTO members to strengthen the WTO book so that it may weather these changes. Michael made a point that in a way, because if you look at the negotiations, they basically may not reflect contemporary challenges. So we need to think of how to strengthen the WTO rulebook so that it can deal effectively with the contemporary challenges facing the agricultural sector. But just as important as the agricultural negotiations is the role of the WTO in the monitoring of agricultural trade policies. While the WTO negotiating group on agriculture tends to get most attention, the WTO Regular Committee on Agriculture also deserves praise for its sterling work. Seeing the committee in action this year has simply been extraordinary. The WTO 164 members have used the committee as the platform in which to question each other on all sorts of policies, old and new policies, with an impact on agricultural trade. This is an international exercise in accountability and a fine example of how to manage globalization and to ensure that it remains in the interest of all countries. This year, the committee has played a critical role in the monitoring of trade policy measures enacted in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Questions posed in the committee in relation to the pandemic have revolved around newly erected border measures and subsidy programs for farmers. Members have sought assurances that these measures will be temporary and non-trade distorting, while many COVID-related questions have also been discussed, such as questions on UK's new border controls on food during the Brexit transition, or questions on recently concluded bilateral or regional trade agreements and their implications for third parties. These meetings are incredibly rich in content and demonstrate not only the need for the WTO as a forum for negotiations, but also a place where trade concerns can be discussed and diffused. This role must be cherished and amplified. There can be no limit to dialogue in the WTO. I'd like to end here. Thanks, Dora.
Thank you very much, Edwini, for these very thoughtful comments. As you said, a bar of chocolate is not manufactured anywhere anymore. It is assembled. and you have spoken extensively about the rise of global value chains. Thank you for those comments. We will now turn to the question and answer session and the questions that have come in from viewers. There are many different questions to all of you, so I will ask you to be extremely brief, please, as you respond, and to possibly not take more than a minute each for each question, so I have time to ask questions of all the presenters. Director General, to the Director General of the FAO, the first question is, what is the biggest lesson learned from COVID-19 for agricultural systems? You spoke about anticipation, and the viewer would like to know what we should anticipate going forward.
Thank you. Very quick, 30 seconds. I think we should speed up the digital big data from the agriculture and the rural areas because it's much behind. And in the city, you can easily get big data, cloud computer. Second, also we have to reverse or remodeling agricultural food systems from the field to the supermarket. That's third, we have to reduce the food loss in the West. Food loss for developing nations, for the West, for all the countries, no matter you're European America or especially in the city. It's a big potential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Agnes Kalibata, let me come to you. A question from a viewer. First, when and where will the Food Systems Summit take place? What are the expected outcomes, in particular on trade?
Thank you. I will answer the question on when and where. We will have a pre-summit in Rome next. We're looking at end of June, July, beginning of July, and we'll have the summit alongside UNGA in September, the General Assembly. In terms of what we expect from trade coming up at the summit, my hope, like I said earlier, is to see more equity, to see that we are coming through on the SDGs that call out what we need to be doing on trade, and to see ambition on those SDGs to make sure that we come through the best way we can, especially given what is at stake here. So we already have targets that we need to come through on. Coming through on those targets would be one of the biggest things for me.
Thank you very much, Agnes. Deputy Director General Alan Wolf, a question for you. What is the biggest lesson learned from COVID-19 for the WTO rulebook on agriculture?
I believe that making information available to everyone allowed for more sensible policy making. The FAO plays a major role in this. The WTO gave full information on the restrictions that existed, but also publishing the amount of crops which were plentiful, which the FAO does, and passing that on to decision makers. And in fact, the amount of trade restrictive actions were rolled back, and they never exceeded a number. I'm not saying effect, but they never exceeded a number, the trade facilitating measures. So governments respond well to having, policymakers respond well to having complete information. Transparency is what we did. Can we do better? We could have better rules for a next pandemic. We don't have that. We have not changed the rules at all. So I think we have to examine going forward areas for change, but we did what we could quickly, and governments responded reasonably well.
Thank you very much. Michael Fakhri, a question to you. COVID-19 has exacerbated poverty around the globe and is reducing access to food. What is your perspective on this issue?
Thank you for that question. The issue of access is, I mean, to start with the point that around 70% of people get their food locally and not from trade. So that what's been working is situations where local markets and informal markets have been supported, and local institutions have been supported to ensure that food reaches those people who need it. So one of the main sources for food, for example, for children, have been schools. So I know I'm at the WTO today, but this has been what's working in terms of COVID. And the other element that's been working in terms of how people are being fed under COVID is ensuring what are called redundant sources of food. So if one system breaks down, you have a backup system. So having that diversity of sources of food is what's working as well. So informal markets, local institutions, local markets, and backup systems.
Thank you very much. Edwini Kessie, a question to you. Is it time to experiment with a different format for WTO agriculture negotiations, given the current stalemate?
Thanks, Zoa, for the question. I do not think the issue is really having a different format. I think the main issue is all countries realizing that if the rule book is to be strengthened, all of them have to play a role in the negotiations. I mean, currently what we have is that some members want others only to take the lead while they do nothing. And I don't think that would actually result in the rule book being changed. We have had the negotiations for 20 years. So I would say that a different mindset that, having a much more fairer, a strengthened agricultural trading system is in the interest of all countries. So all countries have to contribute. You cannot expect a few countries to shoulder the burden. And I do not think that only relates to agriculture, but across the board. So I would say it is the realization, or all countries should realize that if the rule book has to be changed, strengthened for the future to deal with the challenges in the agricultural sector or the trading system, then all countries have to make a contribution. And I think that's the only way for us to make progress in the agricultural negotiations.
Thank you very much. Deputy Director General Alan Wolf, 2 more questions for you. First of all, developing country status in the WTO appears to be a complicated issue. A viewer is asking, how do we overcome that? Second, subsidies. All subsidy negotiations in the WTO appear to be challenging, whether fisheries subsidies or agricultural subsidies. How do we bridge that hurdle?
Thank you very much. Extraordinarily difficult questions, especially the second one on subsidies, which is a very complex issue. Developing country status is not going to hold up progress, in my view. Every country that has spoken to the issue has at one time or another said that they will act in accordance with their capability, their capacity. China has said that. I know the U.S. and China exchange barbed statements in our General Council meetings. But the fact is, China said, we're not going to ask for more than we need. I think we have to get to a point where we're in actual negotiations and the issue will disappear to a large extent, maybe not completely. With respect to subsidies, we have to listen to what other countries are saying, other countries' representatives are saying, and understand their needs, and they have to articulate them better. There will always be some degree of agricultural support. I am here in Geneva, Switzerland, and there are open fields around that could be filled with houses, and they're not. They're farms. My suspicion is that there's a degree of support out there, or those farms would not exist because there's enormous demand for housing and for land. I just say one other thing besides listening. There's a moral element with food that just as there is with medicines. In medicines, we made some adjustments in intellectual property protection to take into account the need in emergencies for medicines, for pharmaceuticals. I think with respect to food, we have to understand there's a moral dimension, as well as obviously, as others have said, including Director General Chu, that the politics of agriculture in a way does not change. It's always much more important to every leader around the world than you would say is true because of the percent of employment or other measures. It is extremely important, and we have to deal with the political issues and make progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michael Fechri, back to you. A viewer is asking about good versus bad subsidies, saying that WTO members disagree on where the boundary lies. What is your suggestion for overcoming the divide?
There's two ways to start here. So I just want to build upon Ambassador Wolf's comment is we can't ignore the political element. So if we just focus on the economic theories of what is trade distorting, what is not trade distorting, it's easy to lose sight of the political dimension. And of course, as Ambassador Wolf said, the moral, and I would add the cultural element. Food is such a core element of everyday life. So we can't treat that as secondary or periphery. So in understanding subsidies, what we're subsidizing, what countries are doing when they subsidize agriculture is they're subsidizing rural life. They're supporting people in rural communities, whether it's through the access to the internet, whether through whatever. And to build on Director General Kyu Dong-gyu, that's one way of addressing equity is through that support of rural life, broadly speaking. So I want to broaden that scope in that way. And then also in terms of understanding what is good and bad, to acknowledge that we're at a point where things are in flux, that we don't know what that means. There isn't a consensus, and that there needs to be that multilateral forum to start anew, to acknowledge that, okay, let's start from the beginning and what is working and what might be a good subsidy here is not a good subsidy there. And let's start with food security and then deal with the implications of trade as sort of responding in that way. Right now, the system is the other way. It's sort of serving trade interests and treating subsidies as something getting in the way of trade. And I'd like to sort of shift that dynamic.
Thank you very much. Director General of the FAO, a question to you. Climate change and the role of trade. How would you suggest that trade policy help us in addressing the climate crisis in the food sector?
Thank you. I want to use a little bit more time too. It's complicated. Of course, everyone faces the challenge of climate change, but different countries have different feeling. That's for sure, because your location is different. We always say the disease business should be related to location. So that's why even the market already said that even from point of view of Minister of Agricultural Sectors and the Minister of Economy and Trade is different. It's because your location is different. Now we are bringing the more complicated issues to environment. So, and I just want to look simplified that we only the solution to establish a new technology to mitigate or adapt to the climate change. That's we learned from the millions of years as an intelligent animal, human being, evolution. You can't change the nature, but we only adapt it to the nature with all means. Not only matter of the agriculture, matter of the way of life, matter of the way of the, and then you wanted to mitigate or modify, resilient the trade to in favor of environment. So I think most importantly, tax. Some products more gas emission, you should establish more tax for consumers. You pay for it, domestically, internationally. So it's not means you have to cut all tax. Some you have also have to use tax as a mitigate or good way to change our way of life, establish a green way of life. Even among the nutrition aspects, you get the protein, but different protein source that have a different effect on the environment. So that's how we have the holistic. I said that we need to establish the holistic approach, not only from point of view agriculture, not only from point of view environment, not only point of view of trade economy, because we are on the small village. That's why we said I really appreciate the make point. You see, we have to build up all the revisit our original aspiration. What is the trade? Basic meaning. We have to keep all the food security first, and then you can make money first, and then you make the complementary use of your advantage, natural technology management. And that's a third level. So that's why all the politicians in the world first look at the basic human rights: food production, food processing, food consumption, food trade, of course. And then come to the second level, economic level, and then come to the last level, highest level, environmental level. So let's build up more holistic way to deal with the complex issues. I hope Paris Agreement will have a new way forward. Let's work together with WTO, with other sectors. I'm willing to deal with those kinds of complex. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We only have time for one more question, and I will direct that question to you, Agnès. A question from a viewer who knows of your former positions as Rwandan Minister of Agriculture and currently as President of AGRA. What is the role of trade for African countries? How can trade help African country agriculture?
Thank you for that question. And like I said earlier in my presentation, when you look at what is happening on the African continent, the dysfunctionality of trade is probably one of the biggest challenges that is holding back food security and holding back the issue of reducing poverty. So for me, from where I sit is, we need to figure out the place of the continent from a trade perspective. We need to, that's why the continent has put in place a continental free trade area, which I hope really gets to work. And at the center of that continental free trade area, agriculture is going to be a very critical element. 64% of the food that is eaten in cities comes from African farmers, is moving around, coming from African farmers. So there's an opportunity right there. So to be able to move the issue of reducing poverty in Africa, to be able to move the issue of increasing food security, definitely market is very critical. Farmers are fully capable of being able to produce. There's so much that has been done in terms of building systems that can help farmers access the basic elements of what they need. The institution I work for, AGRA, does that, and so many other institutions. But there's no incentive for farmers to do more from a perspective of securing their own food security and getting out of poverty without a market that provides the right incentive for them to be part of trade. So Africa has to work on the policies, but those policies have to find their way in World Trade Organization type of policies, and how that provides room and an opportunity, as I said earlier in the SDGs, for Africa and other parts of the world that are not sufficiently trading. I've seen in the report, just a little bit went up, but it's not sufficient given the amount of people that could benefit from global trade, and given the opportunity the continent has, it's just not enough. So I'm hoping that all these discussions you're going to can provide an opportunity to open up trade for farmers, markets for farmers, and therefore trade.
Thank you very much, Agnès. Deputy Director General Alan Wolf, I would just like to hand you the floor to thank our speakers before we close this opening session.
Thank you very much, Dawn. I've learned a lot, which I anticipated would happen. I think we need a new perspective, and we are getting that this morning from all of our speakers. So I realize that those who are watching, nearly 100 people, aren't able to applaud, but we can here applaud and thank all of you for what you contributed.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'd like to thank our very distinguished panel for its comments and for taking the time to be with us today. I would now like to point out to our viewers, those who are with us in the meeting room and those who are watching us on YouTube, that we will now transition to the next session on our program entitled Agricultural Trade, a Vital Pillar for Food Security, which will be moderated by my colleague, Majda Pechen. Can I please ask all the panelists on this session to now log out to make room for the next panel? Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello, Deep. Annabelle, Massimo.
How are you, madam?
Hello. I'm just waiting for Etharine to show up. It must be dawn or night in Costa Rica or in Washington, D.C.
It's 4:30 in the morning.
It's 4:13. I'm waiting for Clem. Okay, here we are, all of us. So, welcome to the WTO Symposium on Agriculture, Trade, and Food Systems Transformation. I'm Majda Pechen. I'm a senior counselor in the Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I have great pleasure in moderating this first technical session where we'll be looking at agricultural trade as a vital pillar for food security. As we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Agreement on Agriculture, and as a token of respect and admiration, I would first like to praise and send my best wishes to the first ever Secretariat team who assisted the membership in transitioning from the GATT to the WTO, and in particular, Mr. Frank Volter, who served as first director of our division until January 2006. In the present session, we'll be exploring some of the linkages between trade and food security. We'll also have an exchange of views with our panel members on the role of trade policy in ensuring global access to food, and we'll also try to gain a better understanding of how WTO can further contribute to lessen food security risks worldwide. I would like now to introduce our distinguished panel members. With us today, I'm delighted to have Clem Boenekamp, who was formerly director of the Agriculture and Commodities Division. Clem, you're an economist with considerable experience in international economic policy with various institutions, including the WTO, the IMF, and now you work as an independent consultant with ID's Center in Geneva. Before leading our division, you've also supervised WTO's most important transparency mechanism for many years. Of course, I'm referring to the Trade Policies Review Division, where you've directed no less than 150 trade policy reports. Annabelle, you're presently the non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. You have a dual experience, dual vision and perspective. First, as a member of the WTO Secretariat, you have served as director of our division, where you have overseen the negotiations in a particularly active period. You have also served as trade minister of Costa Rica, defending the interests and concerns of a small exporting developing country member. Your experience also at the Costa Rican Investment Promotion Agency, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank Trade and Competitiveness Practice, where you have served as senior director, will be also most relevant to our session today as we touched upon trade and investment matters. Let me turn to you, Maximo. You're chief economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And you also have a multifaceted career because you have worked as a research fellow in the International Food Policy Research Institute and as an executive director for the World Bank Group in Latin America. Importantly, you've conducted and published research and analysis in a wealth of topics that will be extremely relevant to us today. For example, poverty alleviation, hunger, the implications of food price volatility for food security, innovation, and value chain development. Massimo, you've also been awarded numerous prizes and distinctions, including the Chevalier de l'Ordre du Mérite Agricole in 2014. Ertharin, in this session, you're really the expert when it comes to the delivery of coordination and humanitarian assistance. You've been a driving force in designing and implementing food security and nutrition policies worldwide, which has led you to serve as executive director of the World Food Programme for 5 years, and also as U.S. ambassador to the Rome-based agencies of the United Nations for the Food and Agriculture. That means Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, WFP, and IFAD. Let me briefly recall that last year, WFP saved lives in more than 88 countries, and in recognition for its long-standing many achievements, in October this year, WFP was awarded the prestigious Nobel Peace Prize. You have now founded Food Systems for the Future, and you are continuing to promote access to affordable and healthy food for the poor. Ertharin, your work in the past decade is simply impressive, and we are very honored to have you on board today. Ambassador Deep Ford, you're the former chair of the WTO agriculture negotiations. You're an agriculture economist with first-hand experience in topics such as food security, trade policy, and agricultural investment. And you have worked both at regional and international level with the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, which, by the way, has observer status in our Committee on Agriculture. You work also with the Commonwealth Secretariat, the FAO, and as ambassador of Guyana to the WTO, you shared the perspectives and concern of a small, vulnerable country in the Caribbean. Importantly, while you chaired the WTO Agriculture Negotiating Group, you have facilitated members' debate towards reforming the rulebook in agriculture in a very wide array of complex and highly technical topics, including food security. So we are really looking forward to your insights. To summarize, I'm blessed with a wonderful lineup of experts and practitioners in trade, trade policy, investment, food security, and humanitarian assistance. So let me also welcome our registered viewers and followers on YouTube to this space. We are looking forward to your active online engagement and participation. Now, by way of scene setting, a lot has already been mentioned in the introductory session. I would simply like to recall very briefly that the preamble of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture sets the scene for us by explicitly identifying food security as an important non-trade concern. The preamble states that commitments under the reform program should be made in an equitable way among all members, having regard to non-trade concerns, including food security and the need to protect the environment. Now, we will have a separate session on the environment, and probably the impact on food security will equally be addressed. So let's focus on food security and the trade, agricultural trade. The preamble really emphasizes that when it comes to agricultural trade policy, it makes a rather powerful statements, which reminds us that although the spotlights often tends to fall on commitments assumed by governments in the areas of market access, export restrictions, export competition, or farm support, not only is the question of food security critical to the membership, but it's actually an issue that crosses over all of these, let's say, more traditional focus areas of reform, and that any future solutions to food insecurity should be addressed in a very holistic manner. So as far as the structure of this session is concerned, I would like to suggest that we have the first round of questions to consider some definitional issues, to have an overview of global food insecurity and trade-related challenges, to look at what WTO has really achieved in the past 25 years and what remains to be done. In a second round of questions, I would like to focus on more practical policy recommendations. I would like at this point to encourage again our registered viewers and followers to send us their questions as soon as the second round of the questions is completed. Your questions will then be conveyed to our panelists on a first come, first served basis. So let's get started. Massimo, I would like to turn to you first, and I have two small questions. First things first, let's start with definitional issues. How does the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations define food security? And the second question is that since the onset of COVID-19, one of FAO's key messages has been that food and agricultural markets have not only been well supplied, but also has been relatively resilient compared to non-food sectors. And this is despite the kind of logistical, transportation, and distribution challenges. So we're now in the midst of the second wave, or maybe even at the beginning of the third wave, who knows? Is FAO's initial assessment still valid? And what are the risks that we should be aware of? Over to you, Massimo.
Thank you very much. Let me start first with a normative question on the definition of what we call food security and nutrition, because it's not only food security, it's also food security and nutrition. So there are 4 dimensions: food availability, that means the availability of sufficient quantities of food of appropriate quality supplied through domestic production or imports; food access, that means access by individuals to adequate resources for acquiring the appropriate foods that they need in a nutritious diet; utilization of food through adequate diet, clean water, sanitation, and healthcare to reach a state of nutritional well-being where all psychological needs are met; and finally, stability. To be food secure, a population, household, or individual must have access to adequate food at all times. So all those are the 4 dimensions of food security and nutrition. And that's what FAO uses, and that's what has been approved by the CFS, the Committee for Food Security. Now, they are really important because, as you can see, it encourages not only that food is available, which is what we have been arguing, but also that people can access to food, but the food has to be of quality so that they have all the micronutrients they need. And at the same time, we have to have stability. And that's what we measure with our food insecurity experience scale, that everybody has access to food at all times. Now, how has been the situation and how the situation has been evolving? As all of you know, at the beginning, because of the lockdown and because of any policy that has been imposed to reduce the curve of COVID-19, has an effect and has a correlate over affecting the economic activity, and therefore, of course, on affecting GDP growth and economic recession. So it's central that we control this, and it's central that we take this into account. Now, in terms of the commodities, we know that food staples are available, and up to today, we can say that there is food availability of staple commodities. In terms of high-value commodities, these are foods which are more perishable. We also know that there is availability. There were a lot of logistical problems at the beginning, which affected more the high-value commodities relative to the staples, because the staples are more capital-intensive. But they were facing some logistical problems of transportation and trade flows. But in the case of high-value commodities, they're more perishable and they are more labor-intensive. So migrant labor was needed, and because of the lockdown, that was not there. But all of these problems were being resolved. There was a huge importance of availability of information to the world, so that they knew the availability of food available that helped enormously to stop and to avoid more export restrictions. There were 20 export restrictions at the beginning, affecting a small percentage of the trade, but today we are in 0 basically, and trade is flowing well. So I am still confident to argue that we have food available. Our major problem is food access. And of course, that is also related to stability and utilization. What is my concern on food access? The concern is because of the economic recession and how this will affect income of people. We are observing today that economic recession is already generating big numbers of unemployment and significant problems, especially in developing economies, which are informal in most of the cases. So that's the major concern, that's the major risk we run. And that's where we need to avoid this turning into a food crisis, because we have food available, but we need to find ways in which we can reactivate economies so that the food access can be there, and we don't have a problem of more a situation of significant numbers of undernourishment. Up to today, our estimations are that 132 million people will move into undernourishment, additional to the 690 million that we have today. That's basically our going back 2 decades, and the same with extreme poverty, 150 million people moving to extreme poverty. So the situation of the food access will be a very difficult one, and that's something that we need to focus enormously, and there are several mechanisms through which we can focus on that. The second risk that we run is that because of this uncertainty of the second wave or potential third wave, we could start to create uncertainty again on the mobility of food, and that's something that we need to be alert to avoid any export restriction and to keep putting efforts of information to minimize any of those risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Massimo. This is a very clear overview. Ertharina would like to rebound on some of the issues highlighted by Massimo, because you have worked very close to vulnerable communities throughout your career. With WFP and now at the helm of Food Systems for the Future, you have a thorough understanding of what extreme food insecurity means on the ground. Can you tell us what kinds of challenges you've typically faced across local, regional, and international value chains when trying to improve nutrition outcomes for the poor?
Well,
over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning. It is 4:30 in the morning here in Chicago, and happy to be here with you with my coffee this morning. Historically, when addressing hunger and providing food, we found that just as Maximo just discussed, that you have the challenges of availability and affordability. And when humanitarians began working at WFP some 50 plus years ago, it was all about food aid, moving food moving food to those who were most in need. And often what we found was that when we moved food, that food aid affected markets and impacted the cost of food in markets, were resulting in deflation in food prices, and sending those often who were most vulnerable even further into poverty because of the additional food that humanitarians brought into markets. As we have moved from simply food aid, but providing food aid only when there's no food in the markets, to actually moving into providing food assistance, which is much more about ensuring that you have cash or vouchers for vulnerable populations that are affected. Then we can support markets and support small farmers and ensure that those questions that Massimo was describing that affect affordability and accessibility, that vulnerable affected populations have access to the financial resources that are necessary to ensure that they can then purchase food. And what we also learned over the past decades of service to vulnerable population is that too often farmers, particularly the poorest farmers, lacked access to markets even when there was no crisis that required humanitarian assistance. And what that meant was that as we invested in small farmer production, there was no incentive for farmers to increase that production because there was no access to markets, and people sold their harvest at the farm gate all during the same harvest period, so selling into markets where the price for purchasing those commodities from farmers was quite low, resulting in lack of economic support that would carry them through to the next harvest. And we often were faced with the cycle of what many have defined as the hunger season, which meant that farmers during periods of harvest had access to capital, but then they were without financial resources during the period of time when they needed to purchase in markets. And so without lacking access to stores, lacking access to markets, we created the cyclical effect of hunger and poverty across too many agricultural communities where the most vulnerable populations that WFP and other organizations serve. What we also know is that global food system, the value chains that are the long value chains affecting the food across the world has never been more efficient. But often we see that the challenges of politics, when governments make decisions to address local politics or economic issues, instituting embargoes or other trade barriers or tariffs that net exporting countries then affect the price of food in net importing countries. And what then goes back to that definition that Maximo gave us of food availability and then food access and affordability. And we're resulting again in markets where that increased the hunger in populations. So at the very root of hunger, of course, is poverty. And the addressing the challenges of providing markets for smallholder farmers, supporting markets that did not result in erratic and high food prices for commodities that affected the availability and affordability also affects hunger. And so the reality is that whether we are talking about long global market systems or local and regional market systems, the ability of those systems to function directly relates to whether or not people go hungry from farm to urban areas. And the proof is and the reality of this is we can, there are a number of examples from the 2007 and 2008 food crisis that where we talked often about the effect of increased food prices on the access to food and markets and the poor and working classes and the effect on high food prices. The examples that were given in the last panel about the lack of access to markets and food and markets during COVID and the effect that created on accessibility and affordability, again, affecting access to food and then resulting in hunger. So I'm honored to be part of this conversation today because it is not just about providing food to the vulnerable populations during times of crisis, but ensuring that we have functioning market systems that support the ability of smallholder farmers to have access to the markets that will ensure their ability not just to feed their families, but to support the systems that provide food to the food availability and affordability and ensuring the affordability of that food for the populations in urban and peri-urban areas. And we cannot food assist our way out of hunger. We must ensure that we have the markets and the systems that support the availability and affordability of food. That is the only way to move beyond programs that will effectively provide access to food, but ensuring that and moving to a system where people have the ability to purchase the food, the nutritious food that is required to meet their the needs of their households as well as themselves. Thank you for this opportunity to participate with you today. And I'm, as a humanitarian, I'm so honored to be with colleagues who are working to recognize that we must move beyond programs to functioning market systems that support access to nutritious food. That is how we will ultimately ensure that we address the issues related to hunger.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tharine. I thought it was nice to have an overview by both the UN food agencies and also given your involvement in humanitarian food assistance. Both Massimo and you yourself have given a very nice picture of what food insecurity means, and especially the dimensions, the 4 dimensions of food security. The most important of which you're telling us is food access and food affordability. Now, I would like to turn to what the WTO has been up to during the last 25 years, and starting with you, Clem, as reflected in the welcome address this morning. I don't know whether you've had an opportunity to listen to it. Food systems transformation to enhance food security is expected to be placed at the highest level of political attention during the UN Food Systems Summit next year. And I wanted you to tell us in retrospect, in WTO's first 25 years of existence, what have been the main achievements of the multilateral trading system in the field of food security? Up to you.
Thank you, Majda. And thank you very much for organizing this session, which I think it's right on the point. It's a very important session. Discussions of food security have been and are central to what the WTO agricultural work is all about. I'm afraid I'm going to say a little bit of what the previous 2 speakers have said. There are 2 critical elements in food security, at least 2, but 2 critical elements: accessibility and availability. Massimo went into both of these. In fact, both speakers did. I'm going to cut it short a little bit. But the agreement on agriculture set into motion a process to reform agriculture, to bring it to a more market-oriented system, as the previous speaker suggested was necessary. And that has led, in terms of accessibility, to a more efficient use of resources, improving purchasing power, therefore improving, at least potentially, accessibility. It is also by lowering tariffs, by eliminating quantitative restrictions, it has made food more available. It has got more able to get from where it is being produced to where it needs to go. And it has been able to do this to the point, as Kessie Edwini has pointed out on other occasions, where as a result of the work that is being done, as a result of this improved availability, some 1 in 6 people are actually fed by international trade. That's a significant achievement, and I think one for which the agreement can take a certain amount of credit. But that said, let's not be confused about this. Trade is not a magic bullet. It needs to be part of a comprehensive policy package, and it needs to be sure that access is made possible. If you have policies that drive the Gini coefficient in the wrong direction, then accessibility, although there may be improved purchasing power, accessibility by the poor is actually going to decrease. It needs to be part of, and both Maximo and the previous speaker have said this, trade needs to be part of a comprehensive policy package. The agreement on agriculture does not stand alone. It needs to be part of a process, a policy coherent framework that enables access to food, that enables the available food, and there is available food, to get to the people who can then afford it. Now, that said, and this is in some sense a repetition of what the previous speakers have said, let me turn just a moment to where we are at the present moment, and perhaps what the agreement has done to help us. There were fears with COVID-19 that the pandemic would result in a flood of export restrictions. It hasn't happened. In fact, if you look at the number of restrictions that are in place, agricultural foodstuffs are very low, rather low on the list. And indeed, the number of export restrictions in agricultural foodstuff are less than half of the restrictions on gloves alone. And gloves are nowhere near the top of the list. Now, part of this, I think, is the result of what of Article 12 of the Agricultural Agreement, which makes it fairly clear that in using restrictions, you need to take the needs of developing countries, of LDCs, of low-income countries, the food security needs into account. And I think members have shown good sense in all of this. But it has also been the case that the agreement, the Committee on Agriculture, which Majda used to be a secretary, and the special session have discussed the pandemic, have discussed the issues, and have made sure that people are aware of the fact that these export restrictions are going to be counterproductive. They're not going to help. This has been supported by, if you put on a restriction at the present moment, at any time, the Agricultural Committee is actually quite active. If you put on restrictions, you're going to be asked questions. And those questions are not always very pleasant questions. Ask one or two members who have done it in the past. They have been in uncomfortable situations as a result. The committee does its work and it does it well. And I think that's played a role in this COVID pandemic. There is also the case that there have been 56 countries who've shown the good sense to take a resolution to resolve not to impede value chains, not to disrupt value chains. These 56 countries are responsible for almost 70% of exports. That's a considerably good base. I think, and that is part of the good sense that runs through the Committee on Agriculture, that runs through the agricultural negotiators, that runs through the agricultural community. And I think that comes in large part because of the process of reform, the process of good sense that was put into place by the Agreement on Agriculture. Let me end on one point that is dear to me and probably dear to Massimo as well. We were both involved in the French presidency. And during the French presidency, there was an agreement among the G20 that WFP food movements would not be subject to export restrictions. The G20 agreed on that. There was an attempt to take this to the WTO. It failed. It didn't make it to a WTO decision. But now that decision is again on the table. It has been raised by Singapore. And I would exhort WTO members to support that decision, to make sure that the WFP, which does absolutely sterling work, is not impeded in moving food to where it is needed. Thank you, Majda.
Thank you very much, Clem, for your insights. And if I may, I feel compelled to ask you another question on this topic of export restrictions. Do you think that the WTO membership is any closer now than it was back in 2011 to reach an agreement on export restrictions? Why now? Why would they stand a better chance now than that when that was discussed first in 2011? Your microphone, I think.
Okay, I'm sorry. I switched my I
Sure.
switched to my telephone for this, and that makes it a little more awkward to see the signs. I don't know if I hope members are closer to making that particular decision. They are part of the WTO because they want trade to be of benefit, to help improve the welfare of their citizens. This decision on export restrictions does precisely that. It allows the WFP to move goods so as to improve the welfare of people who are in need. It is totally consistent with why members are members of the WTO. And I hope that they take this decision.
Thank you very much, Clem. Now, Deep, let me turn to you. Clem has just given us a very compelling picture of where the WTO comes from in terms of its contribution to food security so far, and then numerous linkages to trade policy. Now, you have chaired the WTO Agriculture Negotiating Group, and could you please tell us how WTO members plan to address the food security dimension in future?
Thank you very much, Majda, and greetings to my colleagues on the panel and to those in the audience, and congratulations to WTO on their anniversary and the important work providing a stable and predictable global environment for trade over the last 25 years. Actually, my first point is exactly the point that Clem ended on a moment ago. And that is the important role of WTO members in what I'm going to call rescuing the segment of the population that is facing dire and current food insecurity. And of course, we're speaking about the export restrictions and the need to enable the work of the WFP to facilitate food, access to food to the most food insecure. We heard this morning from Maximo that more than 130 million persons are sliding into food insecurity and extreme poverty. We know that export restrictions have caused delays and have increased costs for food that the WFP can purchase and deliver. Therefore, this is something actually referred by DDG Wolf in the last session as a sort of a moral issue for WTO members. And it is one that very importantly that they can show progress on and leadership on and concern on and the relevance of WTO on. So I think it's imperative that WTO members soon approve the draft decision that they're currently considering, the proposed decision that recognizes the critical humanitarian support provided by the World Food Programme, and it calls on members not to impose export prohibitions on restrictions on foodstuffs purchased for non-commercial humanitarian purposes. There's considerable support for this across the membership. It is an element that can be harvested very soon, and we hope that this is in fact accomplished. My second point, beyond those that are needing to be rescued, is about recovery and building back for increased food security. Agricultural producers and traders need predictability and certainty as they take investment decisions to get their production and trading systems up and running again. Rules governing the opportunities to market their products cannot be changed at a whim or impulse without adequate notification and time. This means progress is needed on both market access and domestic support subsidies. In the context of market access, obviously we would like to see more substantive changes earlier, but we can start up the road with things like regulations on shipments en route, which can be firmed up. On domestic support, the rules governing the opportunities to distort markets through inefficient subsidies, and I say inefficient subsidies because there's been mentioned several times this morning on the important role of quote unquote good subsidies. But the rules governing 1995 or governing subsidies since 1995 are not adequate, and they're not adequate for 2020 and the period going forward, especially as we look at the different capacities of countries today to provide support, different WTO member nations. And worse, if we project forward to the growth of economies and the subsidies that would be allowed in the futures. These subsidies undermine the food security of small farmers and exporters, like cotton producers in Africa, that depend on fair prices and access to markets for their products. So we need to make progress in these areas. My third and final point is on trade rules related to promoting food system transformation, specifically in the light of the lessons of the pandemic and addressing climate change and reducing the global income inequality, referred to again before, exacerbated though by the digital divide. In this regard, WTO members need to revisit how national and regional food security production and trade decisions are affected by the rules on public stock holding and special safeguard measures. Aspects of both are needed for preserving and increasing food insecurity. More active, creative, and flexible engagement, taking the lessons, especially of the pandemic, into consideration, are needed in these two areas. E-commerce rules are also critical to food systems transformation, as they regulate the new rapidly evolving and dominating digital economy. Incorporating the e-commerce changes in the arrangements in how food has been traded and purchased during the pandemic would be a good start. E-commerce sites are the new shop fronts and the new supermarkets. Pandemic grocery shopping and the recent results of Black Friday trading reinforce this trend. Finally, trade and the environment rules are urgent for transforming food systems and food trade. Whether it is production and distribution practices, trade rules can encourage changed operational methods to meet our food security in ways that advance all of the sustainable development goals. Thank you, Majda.
Thank you very much, Deep, because you have really given us a very comprehensive picture, and also I think it's important to reach this understanding that reform is not only necessary within the traditional areas of focus of agriculture, but also in other areas like services, e-commerce. Now, Annabelle, you have just listened to what's on the table and what is going to likely be improved in the context of these negotiations. In your view, and as far as the food security dimension is concerned, should the membership be mindful of any gaps between the existing rule book and what's on the table today for negotiations, especially given the very special trade policy environment that we are in and the ongoing pandemic? Over to you, Annabelle.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Masta, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel. I'm delighted to be with the rest of the speakers today. So let me maybe just take a step backward and start by stating that we know that COVID-19 has had devastating effects on global food security and humanity's ambition to eliminate hunger. And this is particularly acute in the food security hotspots, if you wish, around the world. That is basically fragile and conflict states, countries affected by multiple crises resulting from more frequent extreme weather events and pests, the poor and vulnerable, and countries which have either faced currency depreciation, driving up the cost of food imports, or countries that have seen commodity prices collapse, reducing their capacity to import food. And we've heard from the other speakers that while COVID-19 is affecting all pillars of food security, it is mostly directly and severely impacting access to food. That is the ability of people to obtain the food that they need. There are, for sure, disruptions on availability in certain markets, shifts in demand towards cheaper and less nutritious food, and food price instability. Now, we've also heard that food security requires trade policies that are open, predictable, and non-discriminatory so that food systems and markets can work. And international cooperation is thus key in complementing domestic policies to support food security. So, you know, if we think about the WTO agreement on agriculture, it's quite impressive that since 1996, global agriculture and food trade has seen a remarkable threefold growth over this years. And this has basically been underpinned by the agreement on agriculture and more broadly by the global trading system. But the system is not free of problems. It for sure needs fine-tuning, updating, to reflect the market and policy shifts which have occurred since the adoption of the Agreement on Agriculture, as well as the challenges that we face today. And I would agree with Ambassador Ford and others who've mentioned that it needs to continue to address market distorting subsidies and trade barriers. And I would also like to add that it needs a well-functioning dispute settlement mechanism to enforce agreed commitments. Now, from the perspective of food security, which is the topic of our panel today, it also needs to improve disciplines addressing export restrictions to reduce uncertainty for import-dependent countries. And here, you know, keeping trade open at the global level is necessary to help stabilize food world markets. And this means improved disciplines to reduce the resort to export curves. We know, and we can all remember, that was certainly the time that I was leading the agricultural division in 2007 and 2008 crisis, and you were very much involved in this, Masta, you will remember, 1/3 of countries adopted trade restrictions, and this led to a 45% increase in world rice prices and almost 30% increase in wheat prices. Now, the situation is better today. From January to October this year, the Global Trade Alert reports that 74 countries have adopted a total of 108 policy reforms to facilitate imports of agriculture and agricultural products. However, 62 countries reported adopting 62 export controls in the same period. And most of these bans have lapsed or have been removed. And I think that, as Clem was saying, the Agreement on Agriculture has indeed played a role. I think that increased transparency provided by the Agricultural Markets Information System has also been important. And all this is relevant, but I think we need to continue to remind ourselves about the dangerous impact that export restrictions can have. There's a recent World Bank study on the impact of COVID-19 on protectionism, And the authors of the study find that if export restrictions were to escalate, they will in the current crisis, they will multiply by a factor of 3 the decline in export supplies and surge in global food prices caused by the initial shock. So import food dependent countries, which are to a large extent developing and least developed countries, would be most at risk of these developments in food markets. Mm-hmm. Now, this same World Bank study finds that governments can limit these negative outcomes. Restrictions to exports are inherently better than never policies. So a first approach to address the challenges of COVID-19 COVID-19 could present to food security would consist in actions that are aimed at minimizing the disruption to food supply, such as ensuring that food workers can continue producing under good and secure health conditions, removing bottlenecks that impair food supply chains, and ensuring that trade in key inputs in food production can flow smoothly across borders. So this approach, basically by increasing the domestic supply of food, helps reduce global supply shortages and mitigate price surges, then having a positive spillover effect on other countries. Now, it has been said by Deep and by Clem that export restrictions are particularly damaging when they impede access to foodstuff that are purchased for non-commercial humanitarian purposes by the World Food Program. This, in the context of the current pandemic, these restrictions have already impacted WPF's capacity to deliver and has increased cost, for example, for purchases of rice. And this basically translates into less food for the beneficiaries. So I would like to join Deep and Clem and make a special plea for the WTO members to support the proposal that has been circulated by Singapore and other 31 co-sponsors for adoption by the General Council that would basically provide that members shall not impose export restrictions on foodstuffs purchased for non-commercial humanitarian purposes. And we know, and Etherin was making reference to this, that cash transfers are a fast and efficient food assistance modality. However, in situations where commercial flows are disrupted and markets are not adequately supplied, food needs to be purchased and delivered to feed hungry people. And in this case, export restrictions should not stand in the way. So let me stop here, Majda. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. Thank you very much. And time is flying. I was just looking at the time. I want to pick up on one question that you mentioned. It is the Agriculture Market Information System, but I plan to pick it up in the second round of questions that we're going to have now. I would like to invite the panel to briefly focus on the kind of practical solutions or, let's say, toolbox that are needed to anticipate and deal with food security risk. And starting with you, Deep, I would like you to tell us in terms of immediate or short-term responses, what kind of domestic and trade policy steps would you advise vulnerable governments to take to address immediate food security challenges and improve the resilience of smallholder farming? Now, we have already listened to a few solutions as suggested by the other guest speakers that we have on board in this session. But according to you, for immediate challenges, if you could give us just a few hints, perhaps 1 or 2 minutes. Over to you, Deep.
Okay, thank you, Majda. And thank you for cutting my time, if I might say that. Anyway, let me thank you really actually for recognizing the critical role that smallholders play in the food system. As has been pointed out, smallholders are by far the majority, they feed by far the majority of the global population, and especially their importance is recognized in periods of food crisis when we turn really to the agricultural sector for employment, for food directly in our countries. let me say, in terms of domestic and trade policies for the immediate food security challenges, here we're obviously talking about the need for social safety net policies, policies that can be activated very quickly, whether they are food kitchens, whether they are school feeding programs. We need those social safety net policies to be in place. We also need financial instruments, could be cash transfers, that can reduce the immediate impacts and facilitate stabilization and recovery and keep trade flowing. We also need very good climate monitoring and enabling disaster risk management actions to be quickly employed to save crops and enable safe consumptions. So in a short-term, immediate sense, these are some of the critical domestic policies that affect both production and trade. In terms of policies for building resilient smallholder farming, they are what one might call the fundamental policies that we have used in the past, but that need to be expanded and supported much more in our countries. We're talking here about fundamental things like research on smallholder crops, things like root crops and small ruminants, policies that enable efficiency of trading logistics, that facilitate, very importantly, less than container load to quarter and half a container load, because many small farmers are not able very often, even as cooperatives, to assemble a container load at times. So we need to look at trade logistics in this regard. We need to look at better rural infrastructure and services, education and extension, water use technologies. These are fundamental policies that need to be focused on. And let me just close by saying we need to look at another set of policies that could be classified as being transformative policies. These are interdependent policies. They're a mixture of domestic policies that link into international trade agreements and also to the needs of export markets. We're talking here about SPS and TBT standards and the impact that they have on smallholder farming. And finally, let me say that we need to recognize that the importance of smallholders will continue, and we have to address climate change. We have to address their integration much more into the digital economy and using digital tools in their farming systems. And we have to recognize that they have a responsibility as well in the context of contributing to climate change, and to the extent that we can make their food systems carbon neutral, that will also increase food security over the longer term. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deep. I've already started receiving a number of questions for you and Annabelle, Massimo. I just wanted to say that while you were talking, I was seeing that most of the measures that you are advising small farmers for the benefit of smallholder farming, they're actually fitting very nicely in the green box of non-trade distorting measures in the Agreement on Agriculture. Annabelle, I'm quickly coming back to you, and I would like you to concentrate now on the medium term, let's say. According to you, and drawing from the experience also that we have from responding to the ongoing pandemic, what kind of trade reforms could be undertaken to improve the functioning of food systems in the medium term and also be prepared for future shocks? Over to you, Annabelle.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mashta. This is a very important question, and I think that governments can improve their domestic frameworks to improve the functioning of food systems. They can also strengthen global trade cooperation. They can boost regional trade cooperation and leverage the potential of digital platforms. And let me say a quick word on each of them. First, on improving the domestic frameworks to foster trade and investment. There are some measures here that are important. For example, promote cooperation among customs and border control authorities to implement a simplified, expedited emergency procedure for clearing critical goods with a specific focus on food. Consider lifting tariffs, at least on a temporary basis, on goods critical for food security, such as basic staples and inputs like seeds or fertilizers. Implement expediting licensing and certification processes related to SPS to avoid that legitimate health and safety regulations unnecessarily hinder trade. Use non-intrusive control mechanisms to fast-track the release of goods, for example. Eliminate FDI restrictions in critical export-related services such as processing, transport, logistics, and others. So there are a number of measures that governments can take at the national level. Second important point is to strengthen global trade cooperation. We've heard about the importance of the WTO agricultural negotiations picking up steam to achieve a more open, predictable, and transparent agricultural trading system that supports food security. I think that the by a number of WTO members, reaching almost 70% of global exports of food, to commit to not disrupt the flow of supply chains, not impose food export restrictions, etc., is a very positive development. And here at the level of the global trade cooperation, I would also like to mention the effective implementation of the trade facilitation agreement as something that could help streamline customs and border management and reduce trade costs. The third point that I want to make is boost regional trade cooperation. And we know that evidence show that regional trade can play an important role in fostering food security. And take, for example, the case of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. Members could, for example, provide for early liberalization of agricultural products in which Africans have or could develop a comparative advantage. They could limit exclusions of food products from tariff liberalization and limit recourse to export curbs. They could foster regional value chains. They could take into consideration the situation of informal cross-border traders, most of which are women, and facilitate that. So again, a very important role for regional trade cooperation. And last but not least, governments could also leverage the potential for digital platforms to improve food systems. And this can be very effective in addressing the high transaction cost and information asymmetries that plague the food system. We know that it is hard for sellers and buyers to find each other. And there are many interesting examples. There's this case of Twiga Foods in Kenya that uses a mobile-based B2B digital commerce platform that matches small-scale supply and demand for fruits and vegetables. And this basically eliminates waste and reduces prices. And it's, I think, a good example of the potential for this digital platform. So I think national measures, global trade cooperation, regional trade cooperation, and digital platforms could, in the medium term, improve food systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. I'm sure everybody would like to include all these policy options in their toolbox now. Ertharin, now I would like to concentrate on long-term practical solutions for food security, but also focus a little bit on the importance of partnerships. Now, as part in your career, you've had to build several partnerships in order to deliver simply food on the ground. And you must have counted on the cooperation of trade-oriented stakeholders. Can you tell us how important or valuable such partnerships have been to you to coordinate operations on the ground or to ensure the smooth flow of food across borders or within regions or within countries?
Well, thank you very much for that question, because partnerships are, as you know, quite essential. But before I touch on partnerships, I want to go back to the upcoming WTO, hopefully support for the eliminations of restrictions on humanitarian food aid. And you asked a question of why are we more sure, I won't say sure.
Closer, yes.
Confident that the WTO will support the elimination of the restrictions this time when they didn't in 2011. In reality, now we have some 32 countries that are supporting the elimination of these restrictions, recognizing that in the post-COVID, in this period where we are continuing to address the effects of the pandemic on food security, that as WFP has warned, we are in a position where some 250 million people may now be moved to starvation. And the restrictions on tariff and any restrictions on food aid, which is required to meet the needs of the most vulnerable, will exacerbate the cost and increase the cost of that food and the ability of WFP to move that food. And the global community, thank goodness for the Nobel Peace Prize, is recognizing the value of the work of the WFP and the need for the ability of that food to move. And so there is some anticipation that this time may be different in providing that support that is necessary to ensure WFP's ability to move food aid to the most vulnerable. Now to your question, and let me use just a minute to answer that question, to not overuse my time. The partnerships are essential because trusted, reliable partnerships based on policy adherence by all partners ensure the ability of food to move. And that is not just partnerships with government, but partnerships with government, private sector, and civil society. Ensure not just the ability to move products over borders, but move products inside of in international borders, but regional borders, and from urban to rural areas. Those partnerships are quite important. And when we talk about partnerships, we're also we must ensure that those partnerships are based upon transparency of information, real-time data on stock availability, and logistics provide clarity. The other issue that partnerships ensure is they reduce uncertainties, because if markets are to work, whether those are long markets or regional and local markets, they require certainty and predictability, and those factors are developed when actors trust one another working across the system. And so governments working together move products, food from where it is grown, of course, to where it is eaten. And that is the opportunity that we have in moving from simply discussing agricultural production to ensuring that we recognize that food is agriculture is a system that requires inputs from production to consumer. And when countries realize cooperation is in their own best national interest, they do come together. And these are issues that are borne out not just by research, but by the experience of when the systems are appropriately functioning.
Thank you very much, Ertharin. In the meantime, we have received a number of questions from our viewers, and I'll try to incorporate them in this second round of questions while I'm giving you the floor, and then we'll do another circle. Maximo, you have a question on the Agriculture Market Information System, which is a collaborative market and policy information platform to which various international organizations, including the WTO, are participating. And Clem referred to that initiative in his speech. But for now, I would like you to tell us about the importance of scaling up data analysis and, in fact, data collection and analysis for food security reasons. How can data collection be and analysis be harnessed for the service of food security or reducing food insecurity? Can you explain, especially if real-time data collection, monitoring, and analysis is critical for nutrition assistance, food markets, and trade? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And it's very nice to see Clem after the G20 of Paris. And I fully agree with him. The effort that we did in the G20 of Paris, where the AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information, was created, and also to allow food for WFP to move through countries, it was extremely important. And that's something that we need to keep pushing. It doesn't make any sense that we cannot move food in cases of emergencies than what WFP is doing. So I think that's something that WTO has to pick up and continue working, and it's something that we need to assure. Export restrictions are negative, and any export constraints are negative, and they will create problems. And in the situation we are living today, we cannot exacerbate the situation even more. So again, that's central, and that is completely linked to the question of data, because the bigger role of AMIS, and I think this was the opportunity where AMIS show how important it was, and how important it was conceived during the previous food price crisis, because AMIS was able to come out today at the beginning of the pandemic, explaining carefully how much food we had available in terms of staples and how much stocks we had available. And that was central, because it reduced automatically the uncertainty to the world of that food was available, and there was not a problem of food availability, it was a problem of logistical issues. Now that's something also that we learned, that we needed more information on logistics, which AMIS didn't have at that point, and now we have real-time information on logistic of mobility of vessels and what commodities are moving vessels and so on. Why? Because we needed to alert the world that food could continue to be moving, and there was no way in which we could be healthy if we didn't have food. And that helped to start changing rules and bringing food safety issues to the ports so that food can keep moving. Today, still we have a problem, for example, of crew changes, because some countries still have not resolved that problem in their ports, but that's something that we need to keep evolving. And that real-time data was extremely useful in that sense. Now, for sure, that's not enough, no? And we need to keep working, and we need to keep improving. And here is where it comes an important concept, which is risk and uncertainty. What we know is risks. We know probability of events to happen. We know climate change will happen. We know our probability. We know what will be the consequence, and we can work with that. That's why you have insurance and you have reinsurance. But when we talk of uncertainty, we don't know the distribution of that probability, and we don't know the outcome of that event happening. And that's where we need to start to improve and try to bring more information to be able to prevent that, to be able to cope with that uncertainty. And COVID-19 was clearly an uncertain event. We never expected it to happen at the velocity it happened, and we never expected the outcome that it's creating, which is terrible. So again, that's where new information is coming and good quality of information is coming. What we are trying to do now is trying to create a situation room where we'll bring all these dimensions together. We're trying to bring not only prices, stocks, information on commodities, information on zoonotic diseases, information on pests and diseases, on climate, all those elements that could help us to at least have some more predictive power, because that's central. If we want to be able to manage the risk or be able to understand what will be the potential impact on those distributions of probabilities, we need to have that information. And that's where real-time information could help enormously. And it goes even to the point of NTBs, non-tariff barriers, and food safety issues. Because if we want to create new demand in a situation where the developed countries are in recession, we need to look at regional trade and intra-regional trade. And for that, reducing of NTBs is central, and accelerating the information and tracking commodities using blockchains or eFITO is central to be able to minimize those. We want to accelerate inter-regional trade. We are working hard with African Union to be able to create a Pan-African Food Safety Agency that will allow us to make a reality the inter-regional trade, which is not just an issue of tariff. They already have agreed on that. It's an issue of NTBs, and that's where we need to to work hard and to try to accelerate on that. Finally, data is also important, not only in the dimension of early warning systems, but it's also important to be able to cope with risks, because we need to bring the better use of data to bring precision farming even to smallholders and medium holders. The people that really need better quality of access to information are smallholders, because they have very restricted budgets. And if we bring detailed data for them, which we can today, so that they can really use more efficiently the pesticides, more efficiently the fertilizers, they know what their land needs, and they know what are the trade opportunities and so on around their countries or even within countries. I think that will accelerate this agri-food system transformation and will create more effectiveness in the way we use this information. So we need to put a huge effort in data in two dimensions, in the early warning systems, in the non-tariff barriers, in food safety issues, but also in creating this precision farming that is something that becomes also for the smallholders and medium holders that today is not. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Massimo. To you, Clem, now, before we take questions from the floor, I would like you to focus on the long-term practical solutions to food security and the importance of partnerships, but to deliver emergency financial assistance. Now, some observers expect food prices to surge again, clearly in case the world faces a prolonged or protracted pandemic. Now, should this scenario materialize, in your view, what kinds of partnerships or forms of assistance would be more effective in addressing certain risks, for example, food supply chains, dwindling farm incomes and farm indebtedness, in a way that would be, of course, non or minimally trade distorting? Over to you, Clem. Clem?
Yes, I've just unmuted.
Okay.
Thank you, Majda. Thank you. And yes, a price surge perhaps is a possibility. I don't know. For that, we need more information. Following Massimo, keep your eyes on AMIS. It is doing an enormously powerful job of keeping us well informed. In such an event, the major culprits are going to be, as has already been mentioned by all the speakers, are going to be export restrictions. Join the 31 to pass the resolution proposed by Singapore in December. But Singapore has another proposal on the table. It's a resolution on export restrictions in general. It would be an enormously good thing if in the build-up or at the next ministerial, members could agree on that Singapore proposal to improve disciplines on export restrictions. That said, this pandemic has and is going to continue causing financing problems, as you have mentioned, Majda. Mm-hmm. There are facilities available through the financial organizations to help in this particular process. The IMF has the Rapid Credit Facility. At the present moment, over 70 members are using it. The World Bank, amongst other facilities, has the Global Trade Finance Program. Again, that can and should be used. But here, I think there is something that's important. There are two decisions in Marrakesh. One is on net food importing countries where the financial institutions are mentioned. And the second is the coherence mandate, that the policies should be consistent. The WTO, the World Bank, the IMF should work together to provide coherent policy frameworks. Now, in this particular context, perhaps it is not untoward for this senior staff of the WTO to take contact with the IMF senior staff, with the World Bank senior staff, and to see how access to these facilities that the IMF and the World Bank have can be facilitated for the members. As I said, 70 are already using it. These are invaluable resources. Perhaps the World Bank, the IMF, led by the WTO Secretariat, could now get together to improve access to these facilities. In terms of other things that can be done, I would suggest that more members join the group of 66 that have taken this non-binding resolution not to disrupt supply chains. There are some very important countries that are not yet party to this, and I would exhort them to become members to this. And then finally, and I do want to keep this short, there is an enormous problem in this whole system of food wastage. That requires building infrastructure, that requires building transport facilities, that requires storage facilities. We need to join movements that will improve investment in such facilities so that we can actually prevent this wastage and get the food to the people who actually need it. Thank you, Majda.
Thank you very much, Clem. I have now a question here from our viewers and followers on the issue of self-sufficiency. And I originally wanted to put this to Massimo, but I think this is really a question for all of you. In recent months, broken supply chains have led many countries to start reflecting on the merits of self-sufficiency objectives or the need to build strategic autonomy or any other form of decoupling of production and processing in order to lessen dependence rather than increasingly rely on international markets. Now, is the revamping or reconfiguration of food supply chains happening today? Is this something that we can already observe? And if so, could this trend affect economic and physical access to basic staples and high-value food products? So that's one question on self-sufficiency or strategic economy. And then I have another question here, which relates to data and the issue that of food loss and waste. Oh yes, in their G20 agriculture ministers statement in April, there was a commitment. G20 ministers agreed to establish country-specific targets to deal with food loss and waste. Now, from the point of view of data information, how realistic is this goal? Do countries currently have the data and processing capacity to determine, let alone enforce, such targets if they were established?
Okay, you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Okay, so let me start with the last question on food loss and waste. We launched a very detailed publication, which is the SOFA 2019 of food losses, where we developed the index of food losses, which is helping countries to be able to understand what is the magnitude of the losses by commodity, and also where are the hotspots of food losses. So the targets are put on waste. On losses is basically reduction. Waste is something that UNEP is working. Still, there is not detailed information of the magnitude, but there is enough, I think, so that we can act. The problem we have seen is that a lot of, especially in losses, which go from post-harvest to wholesale included, there has been a lot of problems in only focusing on storage and without looking at the complementarity of technologies. If you store, you need to dry. So if you don't have the dry technology, then it's difficult to do. So there is a lot of effort that needs to be done also to improve in availability of technologies and to improve the effectiveness of these technologies. But I think we have progressed a lot and we need to keep working on getting more data on that. On the issue of self-sufficiency, I think this is very, very, very complex, and it's something that we need to be careful. The whole greatness of trade is that we are allocating resources in the most efficient way, meaning natural resources and other type of resources. So it's very important that we focus on that. A country cannot and won't be able to produce everything they need to consume. And there are countries that have more natural resources than others. How the ones that don't have will be able to get availability to this food. So again, I think our goal, especially on how our natural resources are constrained today, is to be as efficient as possible in the allocation of our resources to get the maximum that we can. That's the goal, how we can produce more efficiently in a sustainable way, but get the bigger quantities that we need, especially of the high value commodities, so that we also have healthy diets and improve access to healthy diets. As today, 3 billion people don't have access to healthy diets. If we don't look at that reality, we will be in a mistake. And falling in this idea of I produce everything I need, I think will be a big mistake. What we will observe for sure is a more mobility of production of vegetables close to cities, because we know that can be done. Those are the products that travel the lower the distances, the less distances. And those are products that can be produced in controlled environments, especially in horizontal farming. But again, that's one of all the multiple commodities. And I think we need to start thinking more on how to accelerate intra-regional trade, for example. What we have seen in COVID-19 today in small island and development states, and how difficult CARICOM, for example, is to trade food within regions, that's something that needs to change. The same in Africa and in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very briefly, is anybody else willing to intervene on the merits of self-sufficiency and decoupling for to achieve food security?
If I can just add in 30 seconds onto what
Yes.
Matt just said, and that is we need more efficient systems that support the movement of foodstuffs, and not just more storage, but also the data and information that supports the movement of products. But I would add one other word: we need more agility in systems. A system that is efficient but does not have the ability to pivot and to provide the access when there are disruptions in those systems is also a fatal system for the movement of foodstuffs and that affect availability and affordability.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I just weigh in on this for 1 second?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
of course.
First of all, the issue of self-sufficiency is very much an issue of national production and what is going to happen behind the border, so to speak. Essentially, what we need to be recognizing here is the heterogeneity of the food systems. The fact that there are smallholders and of course there are large factory farms. We need to accommodate more, and we need to have policy that addresses the needs of the diverse, heterogeneous small farmers within regions and across the globe. And if we make the system more inclusive and they have a greater role in the system, they will participate in the global value chain. So we can't retreat from the global value chains, but we need to promote inclusion by including their crops, their systems, their processes, their transportation frameworks, so that you don't then have this issue of self-sufficiency, because you've got national production systems that are well integrated into regional and global value chains.
Thank you
Secondly,
very much.
On the issue of food losses, I think we've spent a lot of time this morning, very importantly, on basically supply side policies. I think we also need to look at the demand side policies and what consumers can do to contribute to our improved food systems and their own food welfare, whether it's community supported agriculture, whether it's better decisions on nutrition, sending messages from the consumer and greater integration between the consumption side, the demand side, and the supply side, as we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now you each have 20 seconds to tell me, going forward, what would be one realistic action point for WTO to continue addressing food insecurity in an effective and non-trade distorting manner, but above all, in a manner that would spur constructive engagement from all parties involved. 20 seconds. You can intervene when you are ready. After that, we will quickly wrap up this first session.
So one quick point to reiterate the importance of adoption by the General Council of the decision on members not imposing export restrictions on foodstuff purchased for non-commercial humanitarian purposes.
Thank you.
WTO.
Thank you, Annabelle. Clem. Or Massimo? Is
I'm
Clem with
un-
us? Yes.
Yes, I've just unmuted. I completely endorse what Annabelle has just said. I would add that I think it is important that more countries join the 56 that have already taken the resolution not to disrupt supply chains.
Thank you very much, Clem. Massimo?
So I completely agree with both of them. Plus, I think we need to accelerate interregional trade. I think WTO needs to focus on resolving the problem of interregional trade.
Thank you very much, Massimo. Ertharin?
We're really short and sweet. I support everything that's been said by the three previous speakers, but want to underscore the importance of the elimination of trade restrictions on foodstuffs for humanitarian assistance. I think in this period that is quite critical.
Thank you, Ertharin. And Deep, your vote goes to?
I support everyone else and what they've said. Obviously, export restrictions is important, but I want to mention something on process, because I really feel that there are two critical things that need to happen on process. One is we've got to have more cooperative as opposed to adversarial discussions within the WTO. And we need to ask the question, how do we do this better? I think all members need to address that. And secondly, we need to look at interinstitutional approaches so that we can build the interdependent policy frameworks that are needed for the substantial change and the transformative change to take place. We need those rules now so that we do not go back to the old normal, so that we can in fact establish the new normal, and we to stop going back to the old normal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deep. It's been my privilege to moderate this session in your company on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture. Many thanks to all our panelists, our viewers, for sharing your vision, thoughts, and questions. Stay tuned for session 2 of our symposium. Session 2 will specifically deal with the impacts of COVID-19 on agricultural trade, and it starts at exactly 2 p.m. Geneva time. It will be moderated by my colleague Ula Kask, who is welcoming another incredible lineup of speakers. In the meantime, I would like to invite you all to disconnect your systems. Goodbye and keep safe. This meeting is adjourned.